nice. We've got a fun review today as we're discussing The Exorcist Believer. As we venture deeper into the horror movie spooky season, we have yet another entry in the long-running Exorcist franchise, trying to once again capture the glory of that first film. The first Exorcist film, personally, in my opinion, is one of the greatest horror films of all time. Now, most of the films that came after the original Exorcist, I think most of them are pretty bad, other than The Exorcist 3. I do actually think that entry is pretty underrated. So, I was a little bit nervous that we're getting another film in the franchise, a legacy sequel from Blumhouse. When two girls disappear into the woods and return 3 days later with no memory of what happened to them, the father of one girl seeks out Chris McNeil, who's been forever altered by what happened to her daughter 50 years ago. In similar fashion to Blumhouse's Halloween films, even employing the majority of the same crew, David Gordon Green, Daniel McBride, etc., we are going with the legacy sequel route, ignoring everything besides the original film, the sequels, the prequels. It's a smart choice. You want a clean slate to create a new continuity that honors that original film while still trying to move the franchise forward, since it was already confirmed previously that this is supposed to be the first film in a planned trilogy. Unfortunately, if you've been a longtime fan of the franchise, you would know it is very difficult to try and recapture the magic of that original film, and sadly, it is the same case here for The Exorcist Believer. There absolutely was an effort made here to pay respect to what came before in the original film with its usage of franchise staples and similar execution as the original, just now having two girls needing an exorcism as opposed to just Reagan in the original. There are various things in The Exorcist Believer I do think that work better than others, particularly when the narrative leans heavily into developing these characters. They try their hardest to have some level of emotional heft showcasing this bond between Leslie Odom Jr. and his daughter. The majority of that first act or so, as we're setting everything up, I was somewhat getting invested before we do delve into the horror elements and the usual scary imagery associated with The Exorcist. Most of that stuff was working for me until it just decided to pivot into another basic Exorcist film, which I know is weird to say, but if you watch the film, you'll understand exactly what I mean, and the film just shifts. After this point, while occasionally the film does conjure up some tension, it offers up a real lack of effective scares that just is stuff that doesn't stand out amongst a lot of what we've seen in the horror genre. Obviously, mileage may vary, and you might find some of these sequences a little bit more frightening than I would, but if you're a longtime fan of horror, I feel like you're going to find a lot of the scares in The Exorcist Believer to be serviceably formulaic. There's not much about the horror that is any different than any other possession movie. There are a handful of moments where the girls have a solid evil outburst that are effective enough to be somewhat entertained, but it doesn't offer much to hook you in, even when they do decide to bring in Ellen Burstyn back into the mix for assistance eventually. Now, I love Ellen Burstyn. I think it's awesome that she's 90 years old and is still doing great work in movies like this, but her return in The Exorcist Believer is unfortunately quite wasted. It isn't the most egregious usage of a legacy character for a film like this. I think the worst example probably in recent memory is Sally Hardesty in that awful Texas Chainsaw film on Netflix. But from the way that she's shoehorned into this movie's narrative to try and assist with these two girls, I could have done without it. Given the fact that she's barely even in the movie to begin with, I would say maybe she's in the movie for like 10-15 minutes at most. If anything, with most fans, I feel like if you're going to pick a character, a legacy character for the franchise you want to return for this, I think you would want Reagan to return much more than her mother. That isn't to say there aren't any references to Linda Blair's character in the movie. I'm just saying between the two, I would have preferred Linda Blair come back in a more significant role. But that's assuming she wants to come back, which if she doesn't want to come back, you kind of just have to work with it, I guess. What's truly a shame is it isn't the cast that's holding this film back. The cast overall is extremely solid. I already mentioned Ellen Burstyn. Leslie Odom Jr. was great as well. Same goes for Ann Dowd, and even the two child actresses. They are asked to do quite a lot in the movie, giving very different performances before they're possessed and then while they're possessed. And even if I don't necessarily think the scares themselves were that fantastic, the acting performances wasn't the issue. Honestly, one of the biggest things is I feel like this movie could have been a little bit shorter. The pacing is just very sluggish. It's so slow, but once we finally get to that final act, the third act where we have the exorcism, that stuff was actually pretty awesome. It's crazy because it felt like that was where the majority of the creativity went. Scare-wise, it's brutal. It had some genuinely good usage of practical effects. It's just a shame much of the build-up to that sequence has a very messy execution. Like I said earlier, this is the proposed first part in a new new trilogy of Exorcist films, and where this film leaves off, I'm kind of unsure on how I feel about having a new trilogy of Exorcist films. The overall feel of this movie is I'm just very mixed. I would say probably leaning more negative than positive, but still mixed nonetheless. But yeah, The Exorcist Believer is kind of a mixed bag as a legacy sequel. It has a few effective sequences and some emotion behind its overall story early on, but mostly never justifies its existence with hollow execution and an overall lack of creepy atmosphere. That was one of the things that was sorely missed compared to the original film. But those are just my thoughts. I'm sure regardless it's going to make a shit ton of money because that's just how Blumhouse works. But share your thoughts down below once you get a chance to check out The Exorcist Believer. Did you like the film? Did you not like the film? Share your thoughts down below in the comment section. It's part of the fun and the conversation, guys, in the comment section down below. And thank you guys, as always, check out videos. I always do appreciate it. Make sure you like on the video and also subscribe to the channel to update reviews, reactions, unboxings, and more. Next time, see you guys later.